It's a pleasure to speak to you all today on a topic that we all live and breathe. Except for me, I didn't. I left my farm in my early 20s because I thought that there was no future in it. And you might look at that and say, you were right then, what are you doing coming back? But the reason that I left is farming is in a financial pickle, but it wasn't for that reason. Under the Common Agricultural Policy, farming has been stuck and so reductive for so long that I just felt that my job as a farmer was a glorified groundskeeper, maintaining a short rotation and a high spray regime to minimize any variables and just go about doing the job. Subsequently, farming has changed quite a lot. Now that I'm back, I sleep less, I'm more stressed, but I am not bored. I'm going to talk to you about some of my successes and failures trying to implement a more economically resilient farming system and how that coincidentally has led to a more ecologically friendly system too. My name is Tom McVeigh. I was one of the SFI pilot farmers. I'm the Nuffield Scholar this year and founder of our local farm cluster. We'll start with this video of my first and biggest experiment on the farm.
This is field 7 and 8. It's an experimental field where we took all of the actions of the SFI and applied them to their greatest extent in order to see what a farming system may look like under this policy, and then make a comparison between this field and all the other fields which are conventionally farmed in my rotation. So we're standing in a 3-metre beetle bank, which is made up of 5 different tusky grasses, which create a habitat for the predators which eat the pests which are eating my crop. You'll see that we've got this in a row going the whole length of the field, with the idea being that by having the press where the prey is, we maximise the efficacy of their predation. Each beetle bank is 48 metres away from the previous beetle bank, and that is because we believe that that's the maximum distance at which the crop predators will travel to try and get their prey. Standing in a 3-metre pollen mix, these also stretch every 48 metres and go through the entire length of our field. They act as wildlife corridors and they provide food year-round for the pollinators, which are really important to me because I grow various crops like borage which rely on pollinators to yield. In every row of a beetle bank we have planted hazelnuts every 6 metres, and in every pollen mix, which is the alternating 24 metres, we've got walnuts. This is what we would call a 3-storey field. On the top floor we're growing a nut, which is food production. On the ground floor it's dedicated to biodiversity, and in the basement we're sequestering carbon. In an ideal world, we're selling all 3 of those actions and benefiting in all 3 of those ways. In this field is every crop in my crop rotation in the proportion that it exists on my farm. By doing that, I'm able to make a yield comparison between this field and all of the other fields in my crop rotation. And it was important to try and grow every single crop because when I was flying over Eastern Europe and in Asia, you would see the farmers would grow each crop in a row and break it up so that if a disease hit, it wouldn't spread into the next crop. One of the aims of the SFI pilot was to create wildlife corridors joining up as many different habitats as possible. So we dedicated the entire headland, this 24-metre strip, to a diverse sward of grasses and clovers and brassicas, in order to see if we would be able to notice an increase in biodiversity between this field and the ones which are conventionally farmed.
I have seen quite interesting and varied results from trying to do this. One thing that you'll think when you look at this, which I was concerned about, is when you put a row of grass in the middle of the field, are you going to have an encroachment of those grasses into your field? And actually, there is a problem there, but it's not the one that you think. What I actually see is that on a day when I'm spraying, the sprayer will drift into the grass, it kills the grass, the blank soil appears, thistle grows in it, thistle grows back in. So you've got spray days, and you've got spray days when you've basically got a field full of headlands. And the risk for getting that wrong is not a grass weed burden like you'd expect, but it's actually coming from the more pioneer plants. Second thing is just to go through the comparisons between my cereal crops. So for me, that's wheat and barley. And the yield results have been the same between this and the conventional fields. And that's worse because, as you can see from the video, we're not farming the headlands, we're not turning on that, and that's where you're losing yield. So that should be yielding something like 112% to really be even on par with what the rest of the field has looked like. Where I have seen encouraging results is within my break crops, so which by nature have had less money spent on their genetics and their sprays, and they're more susceptible to pests and diseases. So on the right is the experimental field, and on the left is ubiquitous of the 100 acres of beans that I grew last year. In about a 5-mile radius of my farm, every field of beans got chocolate spot. This didn't get chocolate spot. The yield difference was 1 tonne per hectare, and that would have equated to about £10,000 into the bottom line had I been able to replicate it across the rest of my farm. The next thing that I'm just going to show you is this is the establishment from my conventional borage and this trial field of borage. Yield difference 0.45, 0.54, that's a difference of about £400 a hectare. Finally, Stephen showed a photo like this as well. This isn't under a hedge line, this is in the middle of the field. This is 6 feet away from that, and the time difference between these is 3 years. That is a beetle bank with a huff of compost and a tree put in it, and that's 5 meters across, and that's what the conventional soil looks like. I think that that is really fascinating when you look at the soil composition, the difference in such a short period of time, because it was my understanding when I started looking at all these things that this was like a 20-year job. You know, you've got to basically take it out of production, maybe put something in that can give you some production, but you will make that difference really, really quickly, much quicker than you think you would have. Doing the SFI pilot essentially gave me the ability to try and do new things without the economic risk of failure. And it allowed me to make a wholesale change on my farm from short conventional, first to min-till, and now to no-till system. And obviously, these are not simple changes when you actually get into the weeds of it. It's like a bit of a chicken and egg. Fundamentally, the aim to move from mechanical cultivation to letting biology do the cultivation is because it's cheaper and it's effective. But the issue is that the biology doesn't start until the mechanics starts to stop. So you have that kind of 5-year period where you're not getting the results that you need. But it's something that we obviously have to be looking at. There's also a limit to what the biology can do. So in the headland around that 24 meters, I drove on it once when it was wet about 3 years ago. If I don't cultivate that, it's wet. It's wet constantly now because there's a limit to what it can do, and you sometimes need the mechanics to try and fix it. From my perspective, this is all basically down to a cost-saving exercise, and it's just a really odd moment in time in farming where the ecologically friendly nature of farming and the cost saving actually overlap massively. So one of the best ways that I thought I can save cost is to do less soil disturbance. So one of the issues when you don't move soil is when you do move soil, you get greater mineralization for the crop in the first few months of its growing. So when you don't move it, you're at a deficit. So I bought this direct drill. It's a Sky drill with discs. It's got 3 tanks on it. The first 2 go into the same slot, which means that I can put a starter fertilizer in with the seed, and that negates the lack of mineralization from not moving the soil. It's got another hopper here. I put companion crops in. Everything on my farm is completely companion cropped, but you could also use that for slug pellets or for something else. What I think is completely imperative from my perspective is just doing this in one pass, because it saves labor, it saves fuel, it saves time, and it reduces the risk of compaction. I'm on clay soils, so we pick our days, like we really have to pick our days. When I started moving into this system, my aim was initially to grow more spring crops and different species of crops, just to spread risk and as a preventative control against blackgrass. And that saw my rotation go from wheat and rape to wheat, barley, borage, beans, and stewardship mixes. And in years gone by, you would have said to me, well, you grow as much wheat as you can because break crops aren't worth anything. And most years you'll expect to get £1,000 a hectare gross margin from a crop of wheat. And that would have been true, but it isn't true anymore. So I've added this slide which has the crops that I've grown, the yields that I got, the prices that I sold them at, and what the gross margins were for each of them. The reason why, and I would have agreed with the break crops that these aren't profitable to grow, but my establishment method went from the year before where I made no money, which was top down NZA, drill the cover crop, and then in the spring either drill into that or NZA again and then drill it. Unsurprisingly, I didn't make any money. Now everything is established. LDS with a hopper on the back to put a cover crop in, one pass. Leave it for the whole winter and then drill straight into it. I'm certain that the reason why these spring crops yielded so well is because we weren't moving the soil in a spring that was insanely dry. So it went into moisture, it had a starter fertilizer with it, and we didn't touch it again. And that yield difference is why these are two of my most profitable crops, and why wheat, I mean, by the way, my fixed cost is about £850 a hectare. So like, this doesn't cut the mustard, this doesn't cut the mustard, these ones do, and that was brilliant, which was a wild farm wheat, which is a buy crop that is kind of new into the market and has its own pickles, but we can talk about that afterwards. We also have to think quite seriously about the costs that we're spending on. So this year I spent 15% more on metal than I did last year. My agronomist informed me that all the sprays that I'm using from January will be going up by 15%. And the year after that, we have a carbon tax, which is going to put our fertilizer up by another 18%. So the ability for us to grow crops in a way that we used to is seriously diminishing. And we've had years where we've had bad prices and we've had years where we've had bad yields. But what we haven't had is years where we haven't been subsidized. And when we think about that, it's really important to think about how we run our business and how that subsidy has dictated our business. So if I was to use my farm as an example, growing wheat and rape, our subsidy was just under 40,000. Some years we'd make 60, some years we'd make 30, but we never made a loss because that was always a base level of income. Now I'm confronted with, am I going to make 20 or lose 10? And how many years out of 10 am I going to make the 20 and how many years am I going to lose the 10? And therefore, is the way that I ran my business under the subsidy system the same way that I would run it without? It's an entirely different premise because this is one of reducing risk and resilience rather than productivity. I think that I've probably observed 3 strategies for people who think what they're going to do after the post-subsidy world. Number 1 is just bury your head in the sand and hope that neither bad prices or bad growing seasons align. It's too late for that. The second one is to lump in on environmental schemes which do work as part of a plan and they buy us time, but they are not a plan. And then the third thing, which I've seen a lot in where I live further east, is upscaling. You've got farmers trying to divide their fixed costs over more acres by buying new combines or tractors or grain stores. But the problem is that we don't divide our fixed cost per acre. We divide our fixed cost by yield times price. So paradoxically, a lot of these farmers have increased their risk because they've increased their exposure to weather and price, which are the 2 things that we can't control. When we think about what people did in the kind of noughties and 90s, doing that scaled process is a completely different set of situations to the one we're in now because of the subsidy, not because of the climate change, not because of all the list of things that Stephen put up, which are there, but the subsidy is the single biggest thing that is affecting the way that we change our businesses. So in my view, productivity and resilience are basically like on a scales. If you go lump in on productivity, you increase exposure to various risks and your resilience is likely to go down. And if you lump in on resilience, then quite often you see your productivity go down through increased costs or just through spending less time on it. And we are at a crossroads where we have to decide, are you going to lump into one or the other? And I would suggest that the days of lumping into productivity are probably quite far gone. My farm is a mixed farm, so we've got cattle and we've got some pigs. And one of the things that I was tasked with doing under the SFI pilot was replacing this high-yielding ryegrass with a more diverse sward. And I thought that's quite low-hanging fruit when you're pastoral farming, because basically doing that is 90% of the work. So I set about trying to do it in 3 different ways. because I've got 3 grass fields. So the first one, sprayed it off, re-drilled it. Worked really well, but that's quite reductive. So the second one, I thought, okay, well, I will just infill directly into this with a direct drill and try and grow across it, which also didn't work because it just got out-competed. So I came up with this really brilliant idea, which was to put my 6 woodland pigs into the field, cultivate it, re-drill it, circular economy, producing high-value meat while simultaneously doing this job. Carnage. Like, I'll try and see if this video will work. We don't need the sound, but all that happened here for the next 18 months was that I grew thistles. I re-drilled it twice and got nothing. I thought, when you have a perspective of something like inherently being a better method of doing things, you can become a little bit dogmatic with your view. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned from that was that what I lost trying to do that was far greater than what I ever would have gained. And we have to be conscious again of what we're spending trying to undertake these things and what outcomes we expect to get out of them. And again, it comes into what Stephen was saying earlier, you add more complexity, it's great, there's a lot more to go wrong. And so managing our risks is also a really important thing to be looking at there. The concept of a mixed farm, we talked about we've always done it this way, but we haven't always done it this way. We've only done it this way for the last 70 years. Before that, every farm was a mixed farm. And I think that's really interesting because it's a rarity today, but we look at the cereal market as tanked versus the poultry market, which is booming, versus the beef market, which is booming, versus the dairy market, which is doing fine, realistically. And I think that it's an interesting case for us, whether we can utilize our land and put things back in to try and capture some of those other markets and gain resilience in that way. I'm taking another 30 acres out of arable production next year because it's not worth growing any crops in it. I'm just going to put some electric fences and mob graze some cattle. I'm at a point with that. You've seen my gross margins. I really don't have very much to lose by trying to do something like that. I'm certainly not going to end up £4 below my cost of production again. This next slide is just of my farm. And I'm just going to talk you through what my long-term plan is with this farm. As of last week, I got planning for 2 free-range chicken sheds here. I've been waiting 18 months for that. This 100 acres is going to solar. This is the agroforestry field we looked at. These are the next 2 agroforestry fields. This will be the one which comes after that. This is a community amenity centre. So this field is going to go into a biodiversity net gain. It's my worst field. What we're looking at here is essentially our industry is talking a lot about multifaceted land use. So that's like improving biodiversity or sequestering carbon or water holding capacity or water purification. And the question that we have is, how do I get paid for as many of those different things on the same piece of land as possible? And then we also have to think, well, we need to hedge our bets because honestly, we don't know what direction any of this is going in. Stephen's given us a good indication of all the different threats in the beginning of his presentation, that if you sat there and looked at them, you go, I can't account for all of those things. So it's a really important time now more than ever to just spread our risk out. And I think one of the things that really struck me, because I've been doing this job 5 years, is that what I thought I could achieve in 1 year takes at least 5 years. And I have to think about everything that I want to do now in 10 years' time. I'm trying to plan that because we just have such a slow push through in farming. One of the things which I think is, however, really encouraging is on my farm, 30% of my emissions are caused by herbicides. And we've got 2 options to control those. Spray, which is bad for the environment and causes carbon, or plough, which releases carbon and it's bad for the environment. But we are just starting to see these electric weeders come in, which zap the weed, mineralize it, turn it into a fertilizer for the standing crop without having to do that. This is like 10 years away, 5-10 years away, but again, we have to think about we have to scrutinize our own investments and think about where we're spending our money in 10 years' time. What's much sooner to come into the market is these autonomous tractors. And I think that if you're just to think of an autonomous tractor as a tractor without a cab, you've completely missed the point. Because the single biggest efficiency that we've been trying to gain for the last 70 years in agriculture is for one man to do more work per day. What does your farm look like when the amount of work that gets done is nothing to do with how much the man can do in a day? our tractors got bigger and bigger and bigger in order to facilitate that man's work. And then we caused compaction, had to go back and do remedial work to work deeper to fix what we'd caused. We had to take out hedges and ditches in order to facilitate that machine to run. And so what these offer is essentially a much greater level of nuance in field, like the difference between a thick paintbrush which does block colours and a thin one that does detail. And nature is nuance. I think we can mostly agree that nature is important in our farming systems. And these sorts of tools will change very much the way in which we're able to function as a business, because ultimately what our constraints are the tools that we use. You know, we talked about the three sisters. It would be great if I had a machine that could do anything like that, but the reason that I can't is because that takes a man, and I don't have a man to do that job. I'm going to now talk to you a little bit about my research under Nuffield Farming Trust. And basically, my research was taken as a reaction to a sequence of problems that we have in farming. The first is that cereal prices cannot sustain our businesses without government support. The second is that now that we're subject to the election cycle, which isn't our business cycle, we can't have the faith that we need to invest in their programs. And thirdly, that the environmental expectation of us farmers is only going to keep rising. So I started off looking for a high value crop with a low labour requirement that would yield in a changing climate. And I looked at everything from apples and pears, asparagus, borage obviously, grains, things that I can neither spell nor pronounce, before concentrating on walnuts and hazelnuts for two reasons. They're both perennial, which means that they're less affected by annual weather patterns. And secondly, they're non-perishable, so the marketing window is much bigger. The only other requirement to my search was that it had to already grow in the UK, so I had a data reference point. We had a domestic industry for nut production in the 20th century that was grubbed out under an ECC directive that basically gave us guaranteed cereal prices, and that led to the grubbing out of over 7,000 hectares of orchards, not just nuts, but orchards in general, over a 2-year period. In the years between then and now, the producer countries have increased genetics, increased mechanization, and improved their growing techniques. So I've been traveling the world gathering the best practice in each country and learning how the markets function and the sentiments of those farmers. I have two judgments. Walnuts will not work. Firstly, because they're naturalized, they're not native, which means that the productivity of the tree is very, it's not reliable. And the second thing is that the global market is one of attrition. It's like low prices, consolidation, no one's making money. It's basically the same story that we have here. And I remember driving through California, just literally seeing orchard after orchard being pulled out in favor of something else. And so I thought, well, this probably isn't the one for me. Interestingly, talking about climate change, speaking to those farmers, they're no longer growing the crop with the best gross margin per acre. They're growing the crop with the best gross margin per litre of water they're allowed. Like, that's a very different premise to what we're used to, and we should hope that we don't get to that point. However, it was a very different story when I got to Oregon, which 40 years ago grew 0 hazelnuts. It was known for growing grass. Now there is over 100,000 acres, and half of those were planted in the last 10 years. These farmers felt in control of their futures, they're investing, they're experimenting, they were open, and they were making money. And they have the highest yields in the world, and when I was speaking to them, what struck me was that the very few UK farmers are having very similar yields without any of the optimization that the Americans have. Then I went to travel through Europe and I saw something very different, because apart from Turkey, all the other countries who are producing hazelnuts are experiencing something between what you would call a sharp downward trend and a total collapse in production. So in Spain, I was speaking to the farmers there, and the tree needs about 800 to 1,000 chill hours each year to produce its fruit. In Spain, they haven't had it once for the last 6 years. The temperature's been too high. Their yields have gone from 2.2 tonnes to 0.8 tonnes. In Italy, they grow mostly on the mountains. They can't get the water. In France, they're having problems with pests, which we would also have, but they're unable to control them. So there was quite a kind of strong push to looking into how to grow these hazelnuts. With Turkey, which is the world's largest producer, but all the purchasers of hazelnuts are desperately trying to divest their interest from Turkey, partly because of the supply chain and over-reliance, but secondly because they have a manipulative practice and institutional corruption. I spoke to a nut trader in London 2 weeks ago who said that he bought his nuts for £12,000 a kernel, only to ring up to us when they were being shipped and being told, had the paper ripped up in front of him and said, it's 25 grand now if you still want it. So there's quite a clear route to market. The question is one of production. So I put together, this is the map of the world, I put together the cost of what you would expect to establish a hazelnut orchard. And I have also put together a costings which shows your investment and the amount of money you expect to make. You can look at these afterwards, but the important thing here is to look at the heat map. So as farmers, we're generally interested in what the yield is and what the price is. I've done this in this way. We expect to be yielding between here and here. The model that I've made is on this. However, the price of the hazelnut today is over here because they had a frost in Turkey and everything's doubled. This is a really interesting thing, and UK farmers could adopt that were it not for three critical issues. The first one is that the UK farmers currently grow a specification of nut that the market doesn't want. We grow 18 to 19 millimetres and the market buys 11 to 13 millimetres. The second is that we don't understand who, what, where, how to sell or grow these. And the third one is a question of scale, because we're talking about a commodity crop. And so there is a minimum scale that you have to enter into to produce at a low enough cost in order to supply the market. I can help you with the first two, and you can help me with the third one. I've accumulated the practical information on what varieties to grow, what spacings to plant at, what the costings are, what soil types work, what the optimal management techniques look like, where to sell the product. What I don't have is the minimum amount of land required to do it on. So when I say there is a minimum amount of land, I want to be clear. There is a minimum, there is not a maximum. We could plant 20,000 hectares of hazelnuts tomorrow and it wouldn't move the dial on global production. This is a market that is worth over £2 billion a year to Europe alone. It's one that our soils grow the nut in, and it's a market which is insanely profitable comparatively to what we're looking at. What we're talking about is it's almost like the specifications of a cereal crop with the value of a top fruit. And like Stephen will tell you when you're looking at apples is, firstly, if you're not selling them directly to the customer yourself, then any blemish makes a massive difference as to whether or not your product's going to be bought. But also with the specs, it's like consumers are very fickle, and the actual variety of apple that they want will change probably every 10 years, which is not great when you've just planted an orchard. So with these, the spec is literally the variety and the size, and it's non-perishable, so you can store it in your grain store and sell it as you please. We would expect, if you were to get 3 tonnes a hectare and you were to sell it at £3,000 a tonne, you could be making a net or a gross margin of just under £5,000 a hectare. If you were to be selling at today's price, you'd probably be making a net margin of closer to £10,000 a hectare. This isn't a niche crop, and it's not something where the market evaporates. It's not like hemp or some obscure thing that no one's heard of. This is literally a fill up your lorry with 29 tonnes and say goodbye crop. So I think that we are as an industry, we're in a crossroads, and help is not coming and further challenges are. And we have to decide whether we're just going to throw up our hands and hope for divine intervention in the cereal market or a milk market or a pig market, or hold out our hands and hope that the government decides to fund us a little bit better, or take the bull by the horns and actually look at developing our own markets and entering in using the climate change, which we're also worried about, to our advantage, and start to define our own destinies as farmers. I think when we look at the environmental expectations that people will have of us. It's fair to have high expectations if we have fair access to a fair market where we get a fair price. And these are the things that we can't expect someone else to try and find for us. These are things that we have to look for ourselves. Thank you for listening.